back to Power and Purpose. I'm Amanda Sloat.
And I'm Nathalie Tocci.
So Nathalie and I are winding down our first year as university professors with exams done and grades submitted, but we have more fascinating conversations ahead this summer, so please stay tuned. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. Our guest today also is familiar with the academic schedule. It's Cecilia Malmström, a Swedish politician with deep expertise in European trade policy. She served as the European Commissioner for Trade, European Commissioner for Home Affairs, Sweden's Minister for European Union Affairs, and as a member of the European Parliament. Cecilia, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's so great to be with you.
Well, let's jump into the policy questions. And given your work as EU Trade Commissioner, I wanted to start by asking how you're seeing the transatlantic trade relationship these days. We seemed on the verge of a trade war a year ago. Then Commission President von der Leyen and President Trump reached a deal last summer at a Scottish golf course. And by all accounts, it's not a great deal for Europe, starting with 15% tariffs across the board. Was this the best the EU could do, or did the EU essentially chicken out in these talks?
That's a very good question. I think history will tell. Actually, the deal hasn't entered into force yet. It's kept in the Parliament and with the Council, the member states who need to affirm the latest version. Well, nobody can say that it was a good deal. It's a lousy deal. It's a humiliating deal. It's not WTO compliant, and we're worse off than we were before the so-called Liberation Day when President Trump introduced his tariffs. It's also very asymmetric. We don't get anything as Europeans. We get lower tariffs, 15%, but before Liberation Day, they were on average 4%. So it's a bad deal. Was this the only possible deal? Well, you could have taken 2 tracks. You could have chosen to retaliate a little bit just to show that we don't accept this. I think, personally, we should have done that. Or you could have chosen to do this with the hope that things would calm down. And everybody who knows anything about Trump knows that it never calms down. But I think the most important thing was Ukraine, that Europe hoped that if we sort of stay below the radar, we keep cool, we don't anger the president, he will keep on supporting us and Ukraine, which unfortunately for Ukraine and for the world turned out not to be true. So here we are with this deal. Will it enter into force? Well, I think so, likely, because we've seen the new threats on cars and so on, and we've seen threats about tariffs and different actions because of our digital laws, because of our climate laws and so on. So it's still in for a very bumpy ride, I think.
Well, just following up on that, as you said, a lot has changed over the last year, and a lot of Europe's assumptions at the time were premised on wanting to keep the U.S. involved in NATO, keep the U.S. supportive of Ukraine. We still don't have a deal on Ukraine. We had the president at the beginning of the year threatening to take Greenland by military force, and we're now dealing with a war in Iran. You made reference to the president threatening tariffs on autos. I'm curious from a negotiating perspective, do you think the world looks differently now to Europeans? Do you think they would push back, have a different response, for example, on auto tariffs? And is this going to have any impact on the broader ratification? So in a sense, what has changed in the year since this deal was first signed?
Are Europeans smelling the coffee, Cecilia?
Well, I think this last year has proven for those who were not aware before that the Trump administration, they really like tariffs. A deal for the president is a deal as long as he thinks it's a good deal. It can change any moment. There's no stability. There's no predictability. Had the same thing happened today, looking back, I mean, this is all theoretical, of course, maybe Europe would have been tougher. There was a moment when President Trump was on his most aggressive rhetoric against Greenland just at the time of his speech in Davos in end of January, where Europe looked as if they were stepping up and saying that this is really enough. If this happens, this is just outrageous. You don't take a territory that is not yours, an ally in NATO and so on. And more countries and member states and European parliaments and so we're talking about the tool that Europe has called the anti-coercion tool, where you could target different elements, in this case in the US, for excluding them, for instance, from the internal market, from public procurement procedures. Certain licenses could be revoked. There could be taxes on some. It's a very wide toolbox that hasn't been used. So luckily he backed down for now from Greenland threats. But I think that showed that we can't take anything. There is a limit as well. But you know it as well as I do, and I think our listeners, that 27 countries, there are different political, economic interests and so on, and we have to stay united, and that's sometimes tough.
You painted there a transatlantic trade story, which is not exactly brilliant as far as EU performance is concerned. And as you said, maybe today things would be a little bit on the tougher end, but it is what it is. Now, if the sort of grade that we could give to the transatlantic trade story is perhaps just under a pass, given that indeed we are in grading mode these days, I guess if you're looking at the broader EU trade picture, one could paint a much more positive story, because it has also been a year in which the EU has signed a number of other trade deals, Mercosur and Indonesia and India and Australia, and an upgrade of the Mexico agreement. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you broader EU trade policy and how these two things connect. To what extent was the transatlantic protectionist shock really the trigger for the EU accelerating on a number of other trade dossiers?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Nathalie, that this has also had a silver lining. I mean, the EU has always done trade agreements for a long time. I had the privilege to be participant in concluding some of them. But what we have seen lately is almost frenzy of concluding trade agreements from the European Union part, but also we've seen it in ASEAN and in other parts of the world as well. So I think what has happened lately shows that trade is not only about facilitating access to market, liberalizing, facilitating customs procedures and so on. It's also very much about geopolitics. It's also very much about creating new alliances. And we, as Europeans, we trade a lot with the US, and that continues, of course. But I think there is a sort of tendency to diversify, to de-risk, if you want, from the US and see that we need other friends, we need other allies as well. And that's why the Mercosur agreement that has been in the making for 25 years finally entered into force just a couple of weeks ago. India, I think without President Trump, we would never have been able to sign that deal because it has also been 25 years in the making and we have been far apart from each other, India and the US. But now the EU walked that extra mile and the Indian government also said that, okay, we will walk that extra mile. It did matter, of course, that India got 50% tariffs from the US and that they felt really, we need new friends and allies as well. Mexico was in the making. It will be signed in a couple of weeks. Indonesia is in translation right now, so that will enter into force. I think that is also sort of speeded up because of geopolitics. And we have the Australia trade agreement also being, it was in difficulties because of certain elements in the agriculture area, as always, but that was also concluded. So that is the silver lining of this, that we sort of broaden our network, our contacts, and trade agreements are embedded in a broader political partnership as well. So you can talk about research, security issues, green technology, climate transition, and so on. And maybe the most interesting thing of all this is the rapprochement between the European Union and the CPTPP, this Trans-Pacific Alliance.
Yeah, I was actually just about to ask you that, exactly.
Yes. So CPTPP is a very awkward acronym. It stands for Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think, and it includes 12 countries in America, also South America, and in the Pacific. And it includes, important partners such as Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, UK has just joined, and they just gave their agreement for Costa Rica to join 1st of January next year. And that is something that I see can really be sort of the basis of a coalition of the willing or what have you, because they have agreed to launch a trade and investment partnership. They are working on a digital trade agreement. They are working on how to facilitate not only trade in the classical sense with tariffs, but also customs procedures, supply chains, securitization, and so on. So that I think is really promising. And one could imagine now also with the World Trade Organization is very weak. It has been so for a long time. This is not only the fault of the American administration, but that this club could be joined by others who could say that, okay, we want to uphold certain rules. We want to trade with predictability, with transparency, and we are willing to uphold the existing rules, but also work to update them and modernize them. So maybe, the Mercosur countries or South Korea and others could join that sort of informal club. So that's a positive thing happening, I think.
And Cecilia, if we're going to give transatlantic trade a C, broader EU trade policy probably a straight A, given that you have also worked on another critical policy area, i.e. asylum and migration, when you were Home Commissioner, how do you think by we here, I'm talking about Europeans, but how do you think we're doing on that front?
Well, not very well, I would say. There's been a very strong focus on closing the borders, and also the rhetoric in more and more countries are changing that all the problems that we have in our societies are due to migration, which is feeding nationalist parties on the extreme right, but also the general rhetoric that this becomes something normal also among the traditional parties, if I can call them so, that migration is mainly a problem, which is not true. There are challenges, absolutely, of integration. We have, when people from many different cultures and religions meet, there are absolutely challenges. We have lots of problems of criminality and so on in my country, Sweden, but it's also an asset for societies. And that part has totally disappeared. So the main focus now is on closing borders, making sure everybody stops before the border. Asylum claims, if processed at all, should be processed in countries far away from Europe. And I see that sad development.
Immigration definitely remains one of those policy problems challenging us on both sides of the Atlantic. Well, Cecilia, I want to pivot away from the policy discussion to turn to Cecilia's story and want to go back to young Cecilia growing up in Sweden. Like many of our guests, I know you spent a lot of time abroad in your youth. You lived in France as a child. You studied at the Sorbonne in Paris. You worked in Stuttgart and Barcelona. I'm curious how these early experiences shaped how you saw Europe, the world, and perhaps influenced the way you began thinking about a career and your place in the world.
Well, I think at that time when you're a kid, you don't really analyze your life like that. But looking back, of course, it had a huge impact. I had the fortune of growing up in different countries, having friends from different countries as well. And I went to school in France, and I had classmates who did not have any grandparents because they were in a grave in Normandy or in Alsace somewhere. And we talked about these stories, and I grew up in Sweden, far away from the war, where these stories were not part of the ordinary life. And my parents took me to visit all these huge grave fields as a result of the First and Second World War. Lots of young European men were lying. So I think that influenced me. And quite early when I started university and so on, and we started to remotely discuss whether Sweden should join the European community, as it was called at that time, for me, that was, a no-brainer. Of course, we should be part of this. This is so important. We are building a future with our neighbors and with our allies. I was very active in the referendum campaign when we had that. So I think that my childhood and my background influenced that. Hopefully I got a sort of broader view than the traditional Swedish one, that actually people have suffered a lot for peace in Europe.
When we were preparing for this interview, Nathalie and I realized all three of us did PhDs on European subjects in the late 90s. I saw you did yours on regional parties in Western Europe, focusing on Catalonia, Northern Italy. I did mine in Scotland, focusing on the setting up of the Scottish Parliament and multi-level governance. And Nathalie, you were focusing on similar topics.
I did my PhD, well, it was on the Cyprus conflict, but it was looking at the way in which Belgian federalism could be applicable or otherwise to a potential federal solution in Cyprus. So I was well into this multi-level governance business as well.
Well, I think at the end of the 90s, this was kind of a lot debated.
Wasn't it a wonderful world, Cecilia? These were the problems that we were dealing with.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Where did this all go wrong? What happened to multi-level governance? The rise of the region, the hollowing out of the nation state, European supranationalism?
Yeah, well, it might come back, but not on a short-term basis, I think.
Totally. So, Cecilia, you had some really interesting jobs there at the beginning of your career. You worked, as far as we have managed to dig out, you worked as a research assistant, you did some teaching in social studies, but then you also assisted judges in court, and you worked as a psychiatric nurse. Um, it's a really interesting mix of early career set. I mean, I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about those early steps, how they connected, but perhaps even more interesting for our listeners, how did you carry with you these experiences? Younger people listening to us and wondering what is it that their next steps should be? Should it all be part of one homogenous plan? And actually very often, and this is really where we'd like to dig a little bit more into your story, some really disparate experiences end up being what really makes you and what enriches you and makes you become what you end up being.
But that's who we are, no? I think sometimes when you look at people's CVs, you think there has been a clear path. I have known exactly what I wanted to do since I was 6 years old, and here I am today. That is very seldom the case. I wanted to be a journalist, a foreign correspondent. That was my dream since I was a kid. It was really, really hard to get into journalist school. We only had 2 here in Sweden, and at that time it was basically impossible. I tried several times, I didn't get in. So I thought I need to do something else. I'm interested in politics and political science, international issues, and so on. So I applied for what is today a sort of BA in political science, social science, and so on. I worked part-time as an assistant nurse in a psychiatric to finance my studies. And the law thing was, it's a kind of system we have sort of jury duty that you apply 3 years. So you're regularly called to do that, which was a fantastic experience for a young person to learn about less privileged people and how, the different aspects of society. I was in a quite protected world, so this really opened my eyes to see that, okay, there is a different world as well. But that was part-time. And then I was struggling when I did this, was active in the referendum campaign. I was also active in politics, in local politics here back home. And I really struggled between academia and politics and so on. So when Sweden joined the European community in 1994, shortly after we had an extra election for the European Parliament. So I ran for that. And I thought I was going to save the world. I didn't get in, which was a really good thing, because then I could finish my PhD. And then I have a few years of teaching and interacting at the university. And then I ran again in 1999. And then I eventually got elected. Then I had my PhD. I had done some years of teaching at the university. And then I really wanted to play a part. That was a time, if you remember, maybe some of our listeners don't, but that was when the Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union was not there anymore, and Europe was starting to unite between East and West. It was a time of optimism, strong international organizations, lots of countries became democracies, strong transatlantic relations, and lots of optimism. And I felt very deeply that I wanted to be part of that somehow and be part of that new Europe that was growing.
Back to this question of you stepping into politics. I mean, first running and failing, and then running and succeeding, but kind of interested in the actual decision to enter politics, particularly as you were saying, as you were also pursuing an academic career and you're doing kind of a little bit of both. I've often been asked by people, especially younger people, why is it that I didn't enter politics? And I have several reasons why this never happened. Partly has to do with the fact that I don't kind of fully feel I fit into one political party. Another reason is I'm not quite sure how representative I am. One other reason is I think the very significant, frankly speaking, deterioration in the quality of politicians. And so I've kind of asked myself, do I really want to have my colleagues being the kind of people, for instance, that I see in the Italian parliament? I'm not quite sure that I would like to spend my days like that. But the one issue which I have always thought about, and I think it's probably been for me the most important reason why I never did it, is that I was worried that if I were to make that step into politics, somehow my credibility, my, let's call it authoritativeness, right, on particular subjects would be diminished. I mean, I would no longer be listened to as quote unquote, an expert on X, Y, and Z, but I would be painted politically. And that, I think, probably has been the reason that has held me back the most. Could you tell us a little bit about how those pros and cons played out for you, and how, as someone who has stepped into politics, stepped back out of politics, how you have juggled basically with these pros and cons and whether they apply to you at all?
Well, it's a good question. I have always been someone quite opinionated. I had lots of views. It was a horror to watch the evening news with me because I commented on everything since I was a kid. And in the end, my parents said, well, just be quiet and, don't complain, do something, And I don't come from a political family, but when I started studying, I met people who were like me and we started engaging in student politics and so on. So it came quite natural that this was a way that you could influence, that you could contribute to society, but you could also change and you could be part of that change. And when that possibility of joining the European Parliament, when I was eventually elected, this was something I really, really wanted to do. I felt that my whole soul and spirit was into trying to show that Sweden has also a place in this community and showing back to the Swedes that we can make a difference. This is important for us as well. There was a lot of skepticism just in the first years in Sweden as well. So that really, that tipped over quite considerably. And then after that, it actually went quite quickly. I was re-elected to the European Parliament, and then the party leader from the Liberal Party that I belonged to asked me after the elections in 2006 if I wanted to become EU minister. And then once I was in the government, the Prime Minister asked me if I wanted to be commissioner. So it went on in a quite, looking back, it was crazy, but it fell naturally to do that. And then, when I ended my last mandate in the European Commission at the end of 2019, well, that was COVID, so that was a period of reflection for all of us. But after that, I have left politics because politics have changed. In my country, I don't feel at home anymore in my political party. So now I'm fully focused on more the academic and the think tank world. So I'm a little bit of different path to you, but I recognize your existential struggles.
It's good to hear the positive side of that as well. We try and encourage students to go into public service. And I know certainly what Nathalie described is something that many students in many countries feel in terms of negative perceptions of politics. I'm curious, you touched on this a little bit with your answer. Was going to ask how much of this had been a thought or a plan for you. Had you thought serving in national government would be interesting? Had you thought being in the commission would be interesting? And I'm curious how that all played out. And also you have experience working at local level, at national level, at European level. How you compare and contrast the experiences of engaging in public service at multiple levels of governance.
Well, no, it wasn't planned. As I said, I wanted to become a journalist and sort of write about these things from an outside perspective.
Do you regret that now or think about it? I mean, it sounds like it was a career path that didn't work out.
No, it didn't. At that time, it was really hard if you didn't go through journalist school. So at that time, I regretted it a little bit, but looking back, my life might have been different. But no, of course not. No, I don't. Je ne regrette rien. I was active in local politics. I was active in my political parties. That kind of activism was in there as well. And serving in the European Parliament was a fantastic experience. When you negotiate with friends and colleagues from all these countries. At the beginning, we were 15, and then eventually with the enlargement, we became almost 30. I wanted to be on that level and not running for national parliament. But when the party asked me if I wanted to be EU minister, that felt like a fantastic challenge, a chance that I couldn't say no to. And then, of course, after almost 4 years, the prime minister asked me if I wanted to serve in the Barroso government at that time. And that was also, by then I felt that I knew and I understood quite well the European institutions, the interaction between these institutions and the challenges, the tensions, the possibilities. And there was still a lot of optimism at that time as well. It came and I jumped on the train, so to say.
Yeah.
Which I do not regret a moment.
On turning to precisely your experience in the Commission, we were talking a little bit about this when we were talking trade and talking migration, but it's really quite interesting to reflect on the fact that you were Home Commissioner really at a time in which, particularly after the Arab uprisings, the migration crisis started bubbling away in Europe, and then, of course, reaching a tipping point when we get a little bit later, 2015, 2016. But then when you move from migration to trade, there was also another big crisis because, of course, this was the first Trump administration, right? And the first threats of a transatlantic trade war. So I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit about those two experiences as commissioner, and how did you grapple with precisely this issue of when a crisis hits, how do you turn a crisis, in a sense, as an opportunity for further European integration? So how did you deal as commissioner in these two different policy areas in two distinct moments of crisis?
Well, the big refugee crisis came only after I had left my position as Home Affairs. So it was still a possibility that, we were talking about. This was the first asylum package when we were trying to coordinate to make sure that we would receive and that we would process people in the same way. So there was, some constructive feeling both in the parliament and in the council. So it was difficult sometimes, very difficult, but there was still a majority of countries who actually wanted us to do something good out of this, and who still felt that, yes, we need to handle migration in different ways, but we still have that responsibility to receive the most vulnerable people who ask for asylum. There was a struggle, and also I dealt with the trafficking issues and preventing organized crime and terrorism. So it was very emotional because this was about individual people, often in a very vulnerable situation. We managed to get the first asylum package at that time through negotiations. You have to identify in all politics. You have to identify who are your allies in the parliament, who are the allies in the council, who can you work with to make sure that you're not alone when you come up with a proposal, that you have built the ground for someone else to come, yes, this is exactly what we thought as well, or maybe take the initiative. When I was then asked to take trade, I thought, trade, wow, that's easy. Trade is about facilitating deals between countries. Who can be against that? And even before Trump entered, the first aid was under Obama administration. And it was quite a shock because the first week there were massive protests on trade. We were trying to negotiate this EU-US agreement called TTIP, and people hated it. Not in all countries, but in Germany, in Austria, in the Netherlands. I got so many death threats. There were huge demonstrations against these deals because it was just after the economic crisis. People felt that the US would take advantage and they would sort of not respect our consumer protection laws and environmental protection laws. And it was only good for the big companies, and big companies were not very high on the trust list after the economic crisis. So it was quite turbulent. And I think the only way to deal with at that time was, okay, listen, what are the concerns? Try to identify those who are real concerns. And then you always have some people who are always protesting, whatever it is, but engage with those and try to say, okay, we'll do it a new way. We'll have a new paradigm of trade policy. We will make it more transparent. We'll make it more accessible. We will make it inclusive. We will engage with you people. We will try to build a new trust and sort of demonize trade policy, because the negotiations are actually very technical, very boring, and sort of address people's concerns in another way. And that was hard, but I had a fantastic team around me. We worked with this very consciously, and we didn't convince everybody, but of course protests sort of faded out after a while. But then eventually that agreement never happened, and that's a big failure. Of course, it would have been handy today, but it's in the freezer somewhere. We'll take it out. No, I don't think we can take it out. We have to start from the beginning.
I had forgotten TTIP was controversial to that degree. And I guess a good reminder that we have had challenges in the transatlantic relationship throughout the years.
And then came Trump. Yes.
Exactly. Cecilia, we've talked about so many interesting and impressive things that you've done. I'm curious, from your perspective, when you look back, what are you most proud of? What do you see as your greatest success?
It's hard to pick just one, but I think that we managed to change this perception on trade. There's still demonstrations. There's still lots of people who are critical, and farmers will always protest and so, but at least we changed the paradigm. Before that, there was trade negotiations were done between, the negotiators, and they thought nobody cared. But maybe also coming from a Swedish perspective where we have a very old transparency principle and public official documents for 350 years in our constitution. That is in my DNA. So we should open it up. We should show that it's not scary. We should involve people. We should consult people. There would be regular reference groups and advisory groups and so on to follow this. So maybe changing that. And then, of course, we managed to do some very important trade agreements with Japan, with Canada, very important allies today, New Zealand, Chile, Singapore, Vietnam, and others. So this is, of course, teamwork. Hundreds of people are involved. So I cannot take credit alone, but I'm very proud of being part of it.
Yeah, and you were a very important part of it, Cecilia, if I may. But let me ask the flip side of that question, which is, what about failures? What would you consider to be a failure? And perhaps even more interestingly, what do they teach you? How did you end up becoming a different person and perhaps making similar or different choices as a result of those failures?
Well, of course, there's been failures. There are things you try to push and it doesn't deliver. Not delivering on TTIP is, of course, failure. But the most difficult moment in my political career was when I was Home Affairs Commissioner. And this was in 2013. And it was just the beginning of all these boats crossing the Mediterranean. And one morning I got a phone call from the Italian then Minister of Interior. And there had been this ship sinking outside Lampedusa.
I remember this so well. Yeah.
Hundreds of people had drowned. And this was the first time it happened in such a big scale. So, people were really shocked all over Europe. And I flew with my boss, José Manuel Barroso, and the then Prime Minister of Italy, Enrico Letta. We went to Lampedusa. The mayor received us there, and there was a sort of ceremony. And they had, I still sort of creepy when I talk about it, there were these 350 coffins in a huge hangar. And at the very front, there were 10 little tiny white coffins with teddy bears with the kids. And we were standing there as sort of honoring their lives. And it was terrible because I felt that how can we have failed so much that we let this happen? And people were, of course, outraged for a couple of weeks, but then it happened again and again and again. And we haven't learned from this. And this is something I still think about at night, actually. How come that just went away? And that enormous tragedy, people who just wanted a better life. Maybe they were not all been allowed to stay in Europe, but at least how could we not have done more to save those lives? And how come that it is happening basically every day now? That is one of the biggest issues I'm struggling with still. And we haven't solved it.
Not only is it happening again, but it's kind of been normalized, which is in a sense the even more horrifying part of it.
You remember it, yeah. It's not even in the press anymore because it happens, regular. Maybe not at this big extent with these 350 or 360 people, but it happens every day. Those boats are sinking because they are also victims of terrible networks of smugglers who put too many people on a boat and too little gasoline.
Oh, you gave me chills a bit describing that story. And I also remember very vividly watching that play out at the time. You talked about that. You talked about receiving death threats during the TTIP negotiations. How did you manage to stay healthy, sane, balanced during those jobs? I mean, those were particularly stressful moments, but all of us know when you're in government generally, it's extremely demanding. So what did you find effective in terms of general wellness? And curious where you come down on this question of work-life balance.
It would have been even worse today with the aggressiveness on social media and so on. We had social media, but not at the same extent at that time. You try to not listen to these criticism. You try to, surround yourself with a good team and not lose focus on what you're there to do. I have had the advantage of having a large group of friends who don't really care whether I'm commissioner or minister because they like me for who I am. They don't want to talk about politics. They don't care about this. We're just friends. So you have to surround yourself with healthy people who know you from a long time ago and who don't necessarily, but you talk about politics, but who don't necessarily want to analyze everything that you do. And then also, family, kids, husband, very supportive. So I think that's saved me. And sort of, you need to learn to cut it off without becoming cynical.
Speaking of surrounding yourself with important things, I understand you have a penguin collection. And I am so curious to hear how that started and what it entails.
I do. Yeah, I collect penguins. I think penguins are really cool animals because they're feminists. It's the male who guards the egg, and they stick together. They're also monogam. And have you seen them having fun on the ice when they just throw themselves on the belly and just you can almost see them laughing. And they're also very solidaric because they live under terrible conditions and freezing. So yeah, I have lots of penguins. Toothbrushes, blankets, fluffy animals, towels, mugs, everything. And this has kind of spread, not so much now. So I used to get as a gift when I had spoken somewhere, a little fluffy animal or a new toothbrush with a little penguin on, or a spoon or a teacup or something like that. So I haven't counted them, but I should have like several hundred penguin items. My husband has put a limit now, so now you have to store them in a box.
I love that.
Honestly, this penguin story is just so gonna stick with me, and I think it will stick with all of our listeners.
Nathalie, do you have a spirit animal? For me, it's been orangutans. I have been obsessed with them since I was 3 years old. And during my sabbatical after I left the White House, I went to Borneo and saw the orangutans live.
Wow.
So I do love penguins, but for me, it's been orangutans.
No, I've had koalas mainly, but of course I've only managed to see koalas once because I've only been to Australia once. But next one up, because this summer, if flights allow, I'm supposed to go to Uganda. The big thing there is gorillas. My husband is actually completely fixated on gorillas. And so this whole holiday is going to be about hanging out with gorillas. So maybe gorillas are going to overtake koalas. We'll see.
I did the Uganda trek, and gorillas not quite orangutans for me, but seeing the large apes in the wild is amazing.
Yeah, they're mighty. Wow.
Amazing. Cecilia, so alongside surrounding yourself with penguins, which I guess is a really good piece of advice.
It is. Actually, try it.
I think I will.
Let out your inner penguin. Yeah.
I take it as a serious piece of advice here. I'm just wondering if you want to leave our listeners with any last bits of advice alongside our penguins there.
Well, I guess many of those listening are students. And of course, we have been telling them all the time that you have to finish your education. You need to get your graduation. You need to get your exam, which is, of course, important in this world. But it matters less what exactly it is. So follow your heart, do what's interesting to you, because the academic method to think in a sort of scientific way, to analyze and to write reports and to extract the most important thing, that is, whatever your subject, that's the same method. And that's a good thing. If you want to work in the European institutions, applying for an internship is really important. And don't give up. If you don't get into journalist school, you can do something else. Today, the world looks really, really gloomy. And there is a sort of feeling that decency, norms, standards, behavior doesn't matter. You can do what you want. And I think we need to resist that. Just because certain male leaders in the world don't care about that, it doesn't mean that it's not true. You have to sort of have a leadership that is value-based, that respects others, that is inclusive, where you listen to advice, where you can sometimes just relax and be a penguin and laugh and throw yourself on the belly. But you need to stick to those values, because that's what differs us from animals and some of these Cro-Magnon leaders that we have today. So don't feed your inner wolf, but try to be as good and as courageous as you can.
Well, you made reference there to some male leaders. I'm just going to squeeze in one more question and ask the gender question, which is especially for young listeners who are women looking at what's often a very gendered nature of politics, particular challenges that women face in that space. What advice and lessons learned do you have from your experiences there?
Well, it is sometimes very tough to be a woman in certain leadership positions or in certain workplaces and so on. Networks. So you're not strong alone. You have to surround yourself with good people. They could be men as well, not necessarily have to be women, who can support you, who can coach you, who can catch up your idea, say, this is actually a good thing, because sometimes it just drown. And someone said, well, I want to do that. Well, that was my idea originally. And who you could sort of coordinate a little bit with, both on the more serious strategy things, but also on ideas or brainstorming in general. So you need to have that network that can support you and that you can support as well. That's the only way to break hierarchies, sort of locked situations on any workplace.
Cecilia, this has been such a delightful conversation that I wish we could continue for the rest of the day. As you know, we always like to end the podcast on a joyful note, although I have to say the penguin story has brought me so much joy. So let me ask you for our last question, if you can tell us something that has brought you joy in the last few days.
Well, actually, I think we are all sort of junkies following the news and trying to put some order in everything that's happening. And it is really depressing. But this Saturday, an old friend of mine turned 60 and she had this huge party. And we were dancing until 3:00 in the morning. And I saw some good old friends I haven't seen for a while. And that was an occasion to really let out everything and forget about the world and just have fun. So I'm still laughing when I think about it.
Well, Cecilia, thank you so much for this absolutely wonderful conversation, which I think has really brought many, many smiles on all of our faces. You have really taught us a lot about the importance of following the heart, sticking to our values, and obviously, ... surrounding ourselves with penguins. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cecilia.
It's been a pleasure, Amanda and Nathalie, to talk to you as well. Hope we see each other soon in real life.
Power and Purpose is an IE Insights podcast produced in association with IE University and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Production and sound design by Reptile Studios. We'll be back soon with the next episode. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Power and Purpose wherever you get your podcasts.